Howdy, all of you delicious people. I'm here today to view Scott Pilgrim versus the World. So, this movie is to easily be fun because, of course, it represents retro video games, but then also it is to go on and be this kind of Mortal Kombat kind of movie also, where we continue to have Scott who's have to consistently fight all these 7 evil X's, as at some point Ramona is to go on and explain this to Scott, who couldn't have been bothered to read the email that he had gotten because he thought it was too boring. So, come to find out, Scott is also in a band. He ends up playing bass for a band. So, we end up having not only like the fights having to either tie in randomly whenever Scott is to go somewhere, but then is also to be tied into certain bands or certain people who are to kind of be behind the scenes owning certain bands and so on and so forth. So, yeah, like I liked how that's all like interwoven and connected together. I gotta state though, there is a lot going on in this film, exhaustingly so. And so, when going into this film, I honestly had to go on and forcibly watch it twice because it's like, there is so much going on here, and I know that I'm going to miss so many beats and so many things of this film, and really also, like, I was to even need to, like, jot little details and little things down, because I knew there was a big chunk of this movie that I probably was going to miss a lot of stuff. So when we get into spoilers, it might feel very heavily like detailed as far as just me like trying to figure out how to interwove all these things together. But so with that said, this movie to me was a great film. A lot of people can feel wildly differently. Some people could state that this movie sucks for them. I also like the fact that lazy equals humor for this film. Because we have at certain times when people are just like, well, okay, like, I'm tired of having to go on and every single time be yelling for Scott and just be like, yeah, like, go get him, fight. And then by the 3rd or 4th or 5th, they're like, yeah, that, fight. And we have characters that are going on and trying to be like, hey man, we're going to go and get some pizza, I'll see you later. we have better things to do. Like, we're like, we have no ties into this, so we're just gonna leave. Like, we don't really care. So yeah, so we have our characters that just kind of leave, and so Scott ends up having to continue to battle and fight and whatever. And so yeah, so with that said, I think it's about that time to, of course, go on and kind of just like, I feel like teeing up this film is going to be like severely difficult beyond what I've already stated. So Scott, of course, is to go on and be dating this very young girl who is 17 years old, and I believe he's 22. Scott goes on to have this kind of young love brewing to where it seems that they've not really gone on and really express that love very much. They've maybe just hold hands because they're both kind of at different ages. So, but all of a sudden we then have Scott, who is to be fantasizing and having this dream about this girl, where all of a sudden, bizarrely, that dream girl ends up coming true. That Scott is to find this girl and just be like, oh my god, this is my dream girl, and I guess that I should go on and run after her. And we then have Scott realizing that he still needs to go on and break up with Knives because that's the right thing to do. And so Scott does technically go on and break up with Knives in a very crappy way. But then Scott goes and turns around and is to continue to be with Ramona, getting these emails telling him that he is going to have to battle a number of these people, which goes on and conflicts with Scott's everyday life, to the point of him every single day being confronted by one of these exes, to the point of Scott just being like, you know what, like, can I just get one day to myself? Like, can I just go on and, like, catch a breath here? Like, I'm freaking exhausted. And we have these X's that are just like, no, like, we have to fight. And then Scott's like, okay, fine. Or when Scott finally does ditch one of the X's, finally, like, that X ends up just coming right back. And we have a point to where now Scott has to face this X. So so with that said, let me know in the comments below how you felt about Scott Pilgrim versus the World. Some people may have hated this movie. Some people might think that this is their favorite film because it ties music, it ties in a bunch of stuff that is to, of course, be this unique piece of film. So, grading of this movie, I would probably say that it's a great film because I like the retro video game vibe. I think there might be some wavering story parts of this movie that people might find to be too goofy, too off-putting, and too weird. But I still thought this movie's great. So currently, this movie's available on Stars right now, and so I would say that there are other apps that you can go on and find Scott Pilgrim vs. the World instead of Stars. You can, of course, by and large, go on to the Google Play Store and find a number of apps that, of course, I've used through a good stretch of time here. One, of course, would be Doxy, Doxcy. And then you can also go on to other apps that lessen in degree of Scott Pilgrim vs. the World being on there, or possibly having the app easily available to you, but I'm going to recommend this stuff anyways. So, the next app would be Play UHD, or, no, wait, Play UHD. And that app will go on and have a logo that says Fox HD Movies. Go ahead and download that app, and there, in fact, be able to watch this movie for possibly free whenever it comes available. The next app, of course, would be Yes Movies. For the same stuff that I already said in other prior apps. Another one would, of course, be 123 Movies. 123 Movies, you gotta find the right version of 123 Movies because some servers may not work or certain content may not be accessible. So at some point you can go on and find 123 Movies and be able to go on and have it work properly or perfectly and whatever, and you may be able to go on and see a good chunk of movies. Sometimes I would go on and use this app to be able to watch subtitled things because there are certain things that I would rather have a subtitle available, especially if some portion of the film is, or portion of the show is to be in a different language. Then, boom, that's the perfect benefit of having that app. So, anyways, I think it's about that time to just go into double 5 times territory because, again, if I hadn't stated this already, there's a massive number of things that go into this film, so I feel like I'll be taking forever to talk about what happens in this movie, rather than going on and doing little details and just trying to tee this movie up. So that's the big huge beef of this movie, is that it just has so many cut, so many different scenes. So with that said, let's go on into that double 5 time territory, because it's about that time again to, of course, go into spoiler time, but it's about that time you spoil this movie. So, in the very beginning of the film, we, of course, have Scott, who is with the SBB, the Sex Bob-Bomb, or Sex Bob-Bomb. So, I'm going to go on and call them SBB every single time, instead of having to literally go on and state every single one of their names. We, of course, in the beginning of this movie have an intro of every one of the characters. The drummer, of course, is to be Kim. The other guy that's just kind of around is young Neil. We have Steven Stills, who, of course, is the talent. or the lead singer. And then we, of course, have Scott, who, of course, is to be the uh, guy who is otherwise to be the bass player. And at some point, we'll have Neil, that is to kind of be like the replacement bass player at some point when Scott leaves. So we go on, of course, to have Scott that is going to bring over his 17-year-old girlfriend. And we, of course, have Kim, who's giving Scott crap about, like, you have a girlfriend that is way too young for you. And, like, we have Neil, who's asking, well, have you guys done it yet? And Scott's like, no, we've just kind of hold hands. And, like, even that, like, we're kind of just not sure about that yet. So the girl ends up coming by, and we immediately have Steven that is asking Scott. It's like, well, hey, like, is she gonna geek out about us? Like, is she gonna like our music? And Scott's like, yeah, like, she has the ability to geek. And so Steven's like, oh yeah, like, I definitely want her to geek out. So Knives, of course, is Scott's current girlfriend. And so Knives ends up coming in, ends up kind of meeting up with the band. So we, of course, have SBB performing here. And we, of course, have, Knives that geeks out. So we go on to, of course, have Scott asking the band, like, how they felt about Knives. It's like, well, yeah, like, this girl seems really nice, so on and so forth. So we go on to have Scott, who is to be happy that it seems that his band is to approve of his girlfriend. So Scott then goes home to talk to Wallace, who is his roomie, that is his friend. So Scott and Wallace are talking about this girlfriend, and she, of course, is very young. And immediately we have Wallace, as Scott is wanting to prevent Wallace to not tell anybody about this girl that he is to be with. And immediately Wallace is like, well, I'm going to go on and, like, do exactly what you told me not to. So Wallace immediately phone calls Stacy, and Stacy's all of a sudden calling Scott. Stacy knows the 411 about Scott being with this really young girl, and Scott, of course, is like, how do you know so quickly? It's like, oh, Wallace told me. And it's like, that big? Like, so Scott goes on and talks to Stacy, and we really realize that this is to be just some rebound girlfriend. Scott just needs to be with somebody because really, like, he is still kind of dealing with that breakup of Natalie, or Envy, who, of course, is to have been on her own band, and then she had gone on to break up with, of course, Scott, because her band was blowing up. She was touring all over the place, so I guess they just decided to just call it quits. So we go on to have, of course, Scott going on a date with Knives. So they are going and being in this arcade. They're playing this kind of unusual ninja game, and we even have at some point where both Knives and Scott are playing this certain ninja game where it kind of looks like Dance Dance Revolution, but it weirdly has ninjas in it. And I know there's probably a specific game that is to be called, but I have no clue what it is. So I didn't go and fact check that much. And so we have Knives and we have Scott, and they go to this record store, and so Knives is talking about like, man, like you guys are so great, and we of course have Scott is like, well, yeah, our band is great, but like we just haven't gotten really the word out there. So all of a sudden we have both Knives and we have both Scott who bumps into Julie, who ends up being the censorship girl of this film, which I think is hilarious. And plus, also, I liked Julie from a number of other things. Also, to have really seen her Audrey Plaza in a number of other things, like Emily's the Criminal. I recently saw her in, but I don't want to go on and talk much about actresses and whatever because I don't feel like I'll do that evenly everywhere. So, and there's a lot of stars in this film. So Julie is mentioning to both Scott and Knives is like, well, hey, like I have a party going on at my place. Scott, you can come along if you're not babysitting. And Scott is like, shut up, Julie. So we then transition to Scott having this dream. And Scott is to be in this kind of sand-like area, and he's very baffled and confused about what's going on here. So we have, of course, Scott that wakes up to this dream of him having this dream girl. So when Scott wakes up, we, of course, have Wallace that is telling Scott, and I think Wallace is with like the other Scott at this point, and I think that's the gag of like, hey Scott, hey other Scott. So we have Wallace that goes on to tell Scott like, well, hey, like, aren't you going with that girl Knives to the library? Like, weren't you already supposed to go on with her? And so I think this is when like Scott goes on and opens this door to then realize that Knives is right then and there saying like, oh, okay, hey, you were supposed to like be with me at the library like half an hour ago, you silly. So we go on to have Scott and Knives go to this library, and we had while they're getting certain books, and we have Scott who's like, well, hey, this reminds me of school, and Knives is like, well, yeah, I'm sure that was such a long time ago. So I'm sure for the both of them, because I'm sure they probably casted them as certain ages, and so it probably was well beyond XYZ thing. So, and it would be funny to really state like how old that these actors really were through a lot of this film and what they were supposedly playing in this movie. But anyways, so Knives and Scott are making their way down to have Julie work at this library, and it kind of gets to the point where Scott is to see Julie just kind of working everywhere, and then Scott is to say to Julie, it's like, why do you work at all these jobs? And like there's no rational reason for it, she just works everywhere, and so it's hilarious. So Julie ends up getting this package from Ramona, and Ramona, of course, is to be this like Amazon delivery girl, but it doesn't really seem like she has like any uniform or whatever. It seems that she's just independently, like I guess having some like storage place somewhere that she is to just drop off all these packages. And for some goofy reason, I don't quite get how this girl can go on and do this kind of job, because like it seems like she walks to everywhere she goes. Maybe this is such a small town that it's reasonably like an easily distributional thing to do. Not quite sure. But so we have Scott who's like, oh my god, my dream girl is actually real. So we go on to have Scott who goes to this party. And so Scott ends up meeting up with a guy at this party. And so we have Scott that is to do this horrible scribbled drawing of what Ramona looks like. And we have this guy who's like, oh yeah, like that's Ramona. Like I know exactly like who you're talking about. So we have Scott that ends up asking this guy. I think his name is like Camus or something like that. It's some weird, interesting name. And I probably ill pronounced it, but that was as close as I could probably remember to what it really was. So we all of a sudden have Scott who's going from person to person to person because it's like, well, hey, ask those people, they'll probably know more information. So the more that Scott ends up asking these people, we have one guy who's like, yeah, man, she has some real battle scars. And like, yeah, I think there's been a number of people that died right in front of her. And so Scott is going on and getting all this information, not knowing if he could really buy it or not. And so we then have Scott, who is to make his way finally to Ramona, as he is to kind of follow her up this flight of stairs, kind of really get to her, and so on and so forth. So we had Scott that goes on and tells the same story to Knives as he is to go on and state to Ramona, but the only difference is that Scott is to butcher the whole thing the second time around when he gets it perfect the first time around. So Scott is to go on and tell this story about how Pac-Man was originally supposed to be Puck-Man, but for some reason the people wanted to go on and adjust the whole Puck-Man thing because they would assumed that at some point people would try to go on and adjust the P to an F. And so we go on and we have Scott who says that to Knives, and she laughs about it. She's like, ah, ha, ha, ha. And so when Scott goes on and tells his story, he kind of tells it kind of weird or awkward or whatever. And Ramona's like, oh, okay, well, like, that's his story, and she doesn't buy into it. So we have Ramona that leaves, Scott follows after her, and so we have Scott that is like, well, yeah, I gotta get to this girl, I gotta win her over, I gotta try. So we go on to have Scott who fails miserably, and so we have Wallace that comes home and he's like, guess who's drunk? Wallace ends up hitting Scott with these keys, and so Scott ends up explaining to Wallace, it's like, man, I met my dream girl, and we, of course, have Wallace is like, well, can you just state that, like, this is a guy instead of a girl? And Scott is like, well, yeah, like, I met my dream girl, and he's like, guy, and he's like, I think I'm in love with this girl, guy. Anyways, so we all of a sudden have again Stacy, who is getting a quick text from Wallace somehow as he's passed out drunk, and so Stacy is calling Scott now, telling him about, like, well, hey, what are you doing? Like, you're in between two girls, like, you have to go on and break up with Knives, it's the right thing to do. And Scott is like, Stacy, how did you get this text? And all of a sudden we see that Wallace is passed out, but he has a phone, like, by his bed, and Scott's like, okay, touche. Like, all right. So we go on to have everybody trying to, of course, tell Scott that he needs to go on and break up with this girl. And we have Wallace telling her, or telling Scott. We have Stacy telling Scott, break up with this girl. So, especially the whole like the Seinfeld moment that we get at some point of this movie. So we have we have this dream where Scott is going on to get this Amazon box delivery to his home, because since Scott is to find out that Ramona works at Amazon, he's like, okay, well, I'm gonna go and I'm gonna get some cool package and get her to drop it off at my place. And then when Scott goes on and does that and reads the whole emails about the 7 deadly X's, and Scott immediately states like, well, that's boring. So we have Scott that is waiting for this package right at his door, and we have Wallace who states to Scott, it's like, you do know that like this package won't just come today, like it's going to take a couple of days. So we have Scott who has this dream about this box having at some point getting delivered to his house, but we also have to get through some other things first. So Knives goes on is to show up at Scott's doorstep and just be like, hey, like we were supposed to be together. And so they end up going on this like this kind of in general like date again, where they go and do the same things that they pretty much did in the last time. And so we end up talking about the SBB merch and stuff like that during this scene. So we, of course, have I don't think we quite go on and have Scott dump Knives yet. I think he still is to hold on to her. And so, because I know he goes to the wreckage store and he is with Knives, and Knives is stating, it's like, well, I'm in love. And Scott is just like, no, like, if anything, like, I think it's time for us to, like, break up or whatever. And Knives is like, really? And Scott's like, yeah. And so, but that ends up happening, I believe, a little bit later in this film. So, we have the delivery of the box, and so since Scott is to bump into this girl again, he mentions that he had a dream of her delivering this box, and so Scott is not wanting to sign this paper stating that this girl had given him this box, because then their conversation between them will end. So Scott ends up asking, of course, Ramona on a date, and she's like, well, like, if you sign this paper, then I'll go out with you. And so Scott's like, okay, I'll sign this paper, and then we'll go out. So Scott and Ramona go on this date, and we have them just walking, and they end up sitting at this the swing set, and they end up kind of just talking about how like Scott is in between jobs and Ramona is kind of dealing with what she's dealing with, and so on and so yeah. So we end up having both of them together, and Ramona is to mention it's like, well, hey, like, there's this thingy, and Scott's like, well, what's that? She's like, well, it's a door. So they go through this door, and this door leads to Ramona's bedroom, and we have at one point where Ramona is wanting to go on and change, and Scott ends up going into the same room that she's in. She's like, well, hey, I'm changing. And it's like, oh, I'm sorry, I was just really cold. So it seems that Ramona is to give something for Scott to be much warmer, and come to find out it's her own body. So we then have Scott cleverly coming up with a way. It's like, well, hey, like, I think we're really both of us very cold, so I think we should just get under these sheets in this bed and just get really warm. And so, what a player Scott is. So we have them going on, and it feels very tempting for them to just go at it. But Ramona ends up stating to Scott, it's like, no, I don't think we're going to go on and sleep together. But you can still sleep in my bed, so to speak. So we go on to have Scott, who is to find out that he's going on to get a gig. And so Scott ends up asking Ramona, like, hey, do you want to come to my gig? And coincidentally, we also have Knives that is the same gig. So Ramona ends up asking Scott, it's like, well, hey, like, where is it at? And so come to find out, they end up showing the location of it being called Rocket. So we have this gig that is to go on and have this weird, like, Battle of the Bands thing that Steven had gone on to find out about. And at some point, the grand prize is to be working with Gideon's company and being this, like, record labeled, signed, whatever band. So they go into this first Battle of the Bands kind of gig thing, and we have this band called The Boys. And funny enough, we had Wallace who screams, like, well, hey, like, is that one drummer? Is that a boy too? And they're like, yeah. So we have Stacy, who is to meet up with Scott and Ramona, and it's like, well, hey, like, I brought my boyfriend Jimmy, and Wallace is like, Jimmy. And Jimmy's like, Wallace. So we also have to inform Scott that also Knives is here, and Knives is like, yeah, I'm here. Oh, isn't that great? So we go on, and we have the boys that are playing this song, and the first one of it is I'm So Sad, I believe is what it's called. And so what they end up doing is they just go, I'm so sad, and then, like, the song just stops, and Wallace is like, well, hey, it's not a race, guys. And so the lead singer of the Boys is just like, you know what, like, this song is dedicated to the guy that keeps yelling in the balcony. It's like, I think they end up stating that it's like, we hate you and we hope you die. So Wallace is like, yeah, I'm gonna really like this song. So they go on and they play this song, and this song is much longer, and so it was pretty good. So we then, of course, after these two songs, we then have SBB that is to go on next. So we all of a sudden have both Ramona and both Knives sitting together, and we have Stacy who states to Ramona, it's like, well, yeah, like, Scott has so many friends, like, I lose track of all the friends that he has. And so Stacy is to try to go on and have Knives go and talk about how Knives knows Scott, and Scott is telling Steven, like, hey, we need to play really loud and so on and so forth. So we need to get up there. We need to play. So they're playing really loud, and so we all of a sudden have a guy named Matthew Patel that walks in. And so all of a sudden, while SBB is going through their gig, we all of a sudden have Matthew Patel that interrupts this gig and wants to fight with Scott Pilgrim, interrupting what all they're doing. So we of course have Wallace is like, oh my god, who's that guy? Fight him or whatever. So we all of a sudden have Scott who's fighting Patel, Matthew here. And so Scott is like, who are you? And he's like, I'm Matthew Patel. And so some people are to go on and state, it's like, well, hey, like, why is he dressed like a pirate? And Matthew's like, well, like, pirates are really in right now. And so he doesn't really look like a pirate. I don't know where they got that from, but I don't get it. I guess he might look somewhat similar to a pirate. I don't get it. But so we then have to have Scott asking Ramona how she knows Matthew. And come to find out, it seems that Ramona was to have a number of jocks that were all like coming after her one by one. They're all wanting her. So really, Ramona was to find the one guy that wasn't to be a jock to fight off all these jocks with her. And so we have this whole rhyming scheme that goes on, and is to mention how, like, Matthew has mystical powers, and he'll beat him for hours, and so on and so forth. So we even have it at one point where Scott is to pull up the fact that really Matthew just starts to run out of rhymes, and he's like, hey, that doesn't even rhyme. As we really just have Matthew, who is pulling off this whole kind of Bollywood thing with all these like demon women behind him, and they're kind of doing this whole song and dance, so to speak. So we somehow have Scott that goes on to have this whole rhyming scheme that is to go on to get rid of Matthew. And like all these kind of end battles end up kind of very similar, where we either have somebody getting their head kicked off, or we have at certain points where like people are getting head butted, and that's how they end up getting defeated, and so on and so forth. So I think we have Scott who kicks Matthew's head, because I think Gideon, no wait, either way, I think one of those things happen. So all of a sudden we have these coins come flying from the ground, and Scott has realized, oh, coins. And so he looks at all these coins, and it's not enough for bus fare. And so Ramona is stating to Scott, it's like, well, hey, I'll give you the extra change to go on the bus, because I need to go on and explain this to you now. Because Matthew is stating to Scott, it's like, well, hey, like, did you not get my email? And Scott's like, yeah, like a little bit. I kind of skimmed through it. So anyways, so Ramona goes onto this bus and explains about these 7 evil X's that Scott will have to face. And so Scott is just like, okay, all right. But we also have Scott sliding into second base at certain points, where Scott, of course, just wants to make out with Ramona, because it seems that they are to cement that they are dating. So we now have Scott going on Seinfelding his way to Wallace's place. So we now have Scott who's like, okay, I'm dating I'm dating Ramona now, and so we have, of course, Wallace, who is stating to Scott, it's like, well, you definitely need to go on and break up uh, with Knives. Like, it's the right thing to do. So we all of a sudden are going on and finding Wallace, who is watching Lucas Lee, who is his favorite actor. And so Wallace is going on telling Scott at some point that he's like kind of stalking this guy and he's following him at these sets because Lucas Lee is filming all of these scenes in this area. So Wallace at some point is tells Scott, it's like, well, hey, you man, like meet me at this castle if you strike out with Ramona and whatever. So we all of a sudden have this like trailer for this movie that is yet to be released, where we all of a sudden have Lucas Lee, who is Chris Evans, that goes on and states like, after I hang up, you're gonna hear 2 clicks. You're gonna hear me hanging up, and you're gonna hear 1 click of the trigger. I know I messed that up, but I got it pretty dang close. So we then have Scott that goes on and breaks up with Knives at this record place. So we then go on to have Scott with Ramona, and come to find out they're going on to be eating this meal together. Scott is trying to play her a love song, and everything seems to be going horribly awry, where Scott is to be having garlic bread with Ramona, and Ramona states that garlic bread will make you fat. Scott goes on and is to play this song for Ramona. It's just Ramona on my mind, and then it's like Ramona. And so really, excuse me, we of course have Ramona. It's like, well, like let me know when it gets finished. And Scott's like, finished? So everything is failing. So Scott is like, hey, how about you like walk along with me to make our way to this castle, because we of course have Scott that is to put on this hat, because we also have Ramona that complains to him about like, well, hey, I think your hair is getting a little bit long, and Scott is to be reminded of his previous breakup and how it was to be mutual, but it wasn't to be mutual, because we have the narrator that comes in and is to clear up what had really gone on between both Scott and Envy, who is Natalie. So we have Scott and we have Ramona that go off to this set, and come to find out, while Wallace, Scott, and Ramona are talking about this movie, we go on to, of course, have Ramona, who is to know Lucas Lee really well. And so Scott is like, oh my god, is this one of your... And like Ramona's like, yep. So we have Scott that is going on and like looking at Lucas Lee, and he's just starstruck. He's like, oh my god. So Lucas Lee gets on set, and we have this kind of dun, 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 and then so we have Lucas that makes his way on the skateboard into this piece. And so the first line that he delivers is that this whole line about 2 minutes that it's going to take the only thing in between me and my girl is the 2 minutes it's gonna take to beat you up. And so Scott Pilgrim is looking on at this scene and he's like, oh my god, I'm just captured by me watching a movie scene unfold. And we all of a sudden have Lucas Lee that is stating, I'm talking to you, Scott Pilgrim. And, and Scott is like, oh my god, Lucas Lee is talking to me. And so, like, Lucas is just walking over to Scott. And then Scott is like, whoa, like, he's gonna beat me up. Like, hey, Lucas Lee, can I get your autograph? So Lucas punches out Scott, and so then Lucas turns to Ramona. It's like, hey, Ramona, how's it going? And so we realize now that the fight is on, and so Scott ends up trying to go on and fight with Lucas Lee as they yell cut on set. So we have Scott that tries to grab onto who he thinks is Lucas Lee, and then we find out that this is his stunt double. And we, of course, have Lucas Lee, who's just like, well, yeah, I have him do all my wide shots while I'm going back into my trailer and smoke weed and peyote or whatever. So we all of a sudden come to find out that Lucas Lee doesn't have one stunt double, he has many. And so he's like, yeah, I won't go anywhere without my stunt team. And so, like, this guy who was to go on and be this pro skater now is to become this actor, is to bizarrely need a number of different stuntmen. Because he turns, like, that's his backstory, that he was to be this pro skater now turned actor. So it's like, okay. So we have now Scott who has to fight all of these stunt doubles, and we go on to have Lucas Lee who's like sipping this coffee, and he's just like, yeah, like I'm just gonna go on and take five, and so while Scott is going on and annihilating with all these skateboards of all these stunt doubles and decking all of them, we then have Scott who's to call Lucas Lee of like, Mr. Lee, you're wanted back on set. So Lucas goes on to then fight Scott and punches him through this kind of screen and this like fake background. So we have Lucas is like, okay, like I think you've had enough. So Lucas, and so Scott's like, man, you're a good actor. Lucas Lee is like, yeah, I'm up for this year. So we have Scott who's just like, well, hey, like, you can't ignore a stunt, right? So Scott is to look at Lee and say, like, well, hey, look at this big, huge, like, kind of thing over here. Can you do this thingy? And Lucas Lee is like, it's called a grind. And so Scott is like, yeah, can you do that thingy? Can you do it? And the guy's like, these rails are kind of janky, and I don't know. And so Scott's like, well, hey, if you can't do it. So we have Lucas that tries it, and at some point, he seems to go throughout this whole trick thing perfectly, but then at the last bit of it, he bails, and that's what kills his character off. So Scott technically doesn't really have to, like, figure out a way to knock out Lee here. He kind of takes himself out. So Scott is to just be regretting that he did not go on and get an autograph from Lucas Lee. He's like, oh my god, I didn't get the autograph. So we end up having, like, points being shown in the distance. I guess Scott is going to level up soon. I don't know. So after that, we have both Scott and Wallace realize that Ramona had just bailed. So they're like, okay, like, that seemed just kind of weird. So The next thing we know is both Scott and Wallace are to again be talking, and we have Envy calling Scott, asking him about like, well, hey, like I'm back in town, I'm back in Toronto, like how are things? And so Scott's like, well, yeah, I have a new girlfriend, and so Envy's like, oh, and so Scott's like, yeah, she's American, and this and that, and so Envy's like, oh, okay. So the next thing we end up seeing after that is also that there's another phone call, and it's Knives, and she is coming right outside she's right outside Scott's door. So Wallace ends up going on to answer the door as Scott is breaking and jumping and breaking through this window, and is to now all of a sudden be behind Knives. He grabbed his coat before he left, and so he's kind of just walking off, and Wallace has to break the news to Knives that Scott is gone. So we have Scott that is kind of walking on his own, and we all of a sudden have Scott who's realizing again that he has to, in his brain, kind of process this whole Evil X thing, all seven of them. And all of a sudden we have someone coming flying in, which Scott can't really, like, tell all that well who it is. So Scott all of a sudden is to go on and, like, punch up in the air, and because Scott wants nothing to do with this. And so we then have Roxy that appears like, hey, you just punched me in the chest. So Scott ends up stating, it's like, well, hey, like, you know what? Like, I can't go on and deal with this right now. Like, I'm having a lot of, like, issues. Like, just, can we rain check this? Or can we just go on and do this another time? And Roxy's like, fine. But like when we get to this, like we're definitely, like, you're gonna regret. So we then go on to have Scott going to Stacy's, because Scott is calling Stacy and is like, hey, can we talk for a minute? And Stacy's like, well, hey, I'm just leaving my job. And Scott is like, well, hey, I'll be right there. So as Scott is making his way to this coffee place, Stacy's already gone. And so now Scott is looking at Julie, and Scott's like, Julie, how do you work at all these places? And she's like, well, I work at all these places. And we have Scott who's like, how are you censoring yourself like that? She's like, because I fucking can. Like, and this and that. It's all these lines and all these things. So we also even had a point where I think both Steven and Julie were to be item through this movie. We kind of see them both together. But like, it feels like Julie is sometimes kind of pushing Steven away at some points. But anyways, we don't see that exactly here, but still, it's throughout the movie somewhere. So we all of a sudden have, like, Julie who's making a copy for Scott, and Scott all of a sudden is to bump into Envy because she's back in town. Her band is playing. So we have Scott and Envy kind of chatting and checking up on things, and so really there's to be this moment of Scott just going on and be like, well, I think I've kind of moved on from her. Like, I definitely had this girl that is to really be the one that I really want, yada yada yada. So we have then Scott that is to go on to this point where he's like, well, yeah, I don't want to be with Envy anymore. And the very next thing, we have Steven who states to uh, to Scott that it's like, well, hey, we're doing this secret gig, and the Clash of the Demon Head wants to go on and have us be the opening act of that gig. And Scott's like, no. And Steven's like, well, hey, we need this exposure, like, we need this gig. And so Scott is like, fine. So we also have Knives, who has gone on to be with young Neil, and like, I think this is when Scott decides that he no longer wants to be the bass player in the band, and it's like, well, he just walks off, and young Neil's like, well, I guess I'll play bass now. So we have Knives that goes on to find out that Steven and Scott and Ramona are together, and they're being all coy and everything like that. And Scott is asking Ramona, like, well, hey, what should I do? So we also have Knives looking through this window, and she's all teary-eyed, and she's looking at Scott. She's like, ah. So Knives gets very jealous, and is to say, it's like, well, hey, like, this girl is to be much older than me, and she knows more music than I do. She already has a head start on me because she's much older. So we have Knives that goes on to try and dye her hair like Ramona, because Ramona goes on, and every week and a half she dyes her hair a brand new color. And so, because we'll consistently see her changing her hair, and there won't be, like, they'll just all of a sudden she'll be in frame, and they'll be like, wait a minute, like, now all of a sudden her hair is green, now all of a sudden her hair is pink, now all of a sudden her hair is blue, and she doesn't make a big deal about it. And Scott likes that because it shows that she's, like, spontaneous, and she's this, and she's that. She's unpredictable. So we have Knives that follows in that footstep, and is to dye her hair blue, the same color as Ramona's. So, and Ramona's going on and talking to her sister, her relative, and is stating that she's going to go on and get even, and, like, she ends up putting her hair into this tub, and her sister states, like, I can't even hear you now, because you're blah, 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 and she's like, I don't know what you're saying. So we go on to this next gig. So, we have a lot of times where these characters go on and either say yeah, or they end up saying, I think they end up saying another word a lot in some part of somewhere. I'm not quite sure what it is. But so we have Sex Bomb that goes on to do their opening, and they quickly finish, and then they're done, to have Clash of the Demon Head come up. And we, of course, then have Scott that is going on and talking to Ramona, and is talking about the Clash of the Demon Head, and is stating, like, well, hey, you know that bass player, the guy named Todd, like, that's who he is, yada yada. And Ramona's like, yeah, I know who exactly that is. And Scott is like, oh crap, because he knows he's the next guy he's gonna have to fight. So we come to find the band has also been invited backstage. So after they are to go on and do this performance, they're all backstage, because Julia is to tell the band they're invited. So they all go back there, and so come to find out, we of course have Ramona stating, like, how at some point both Todd and her were to get together, because Ramona and Todd were only together for a brief time when Lucas was looking for Ramona, and instead Ramona was locking lips with Todd. And so, with it seemed Todd having these vegan powers, and bizarrely Todd going on and punching the moon for Ramona and all these kinds of things, like, but their relationship just really did not last. So we find out that Todd is a vegan, and it's like, well, what does that all mean? And he's like, well, I don't take from anything that has a face. And so it's like, oh, okay, all right. So come to find out, Todd is to have these vegan powers because, of course, Scott is to go on and want to punch Todd, and Todd is to stop him with this seemingly vegan force field. So we have Scott, who ends up being smashed through all these walls through quite a bit of this fight sequence. And so we have Todd fighting Scott, and we even have at one point where the SBB stated, like, well, hey man, like, we're gonna leave for some pizza, see you later. So we have Scott and we have Todd, and so Scott figures out how to beat Todd by going on and having these 2 cups of this drink. And Scott's like, well, hey, like, how about we go on and we just kind of just share this drink together, like, as friends, and I'm going to give you this soy. And Todd's like, I know that you didn't go on and have soy in that. It's actually half and half. And because I saw it through my mind's eye. And Scott is just like, well, okay then, like, take the one that's the right one. So we go on to, of course, have Todd, who downs this drink. And then Scott explains, it's like, well, yeah, you just had half and half, baby. Like, you just drank half and half because I switched the drinks and you didn't know. So all of a sudden, the vegan police just bursts in and is to arrest Todd for all of the previous vegan penalties that he had at some point done. So one of them ends up being like like an omelet, and the next thing ends up being like a thing of chicken, and we consistently have, like, Todd was like, well, like, chicken's vegan, right? Because Todd was to state, it's like, well, there should be a 3-strike system. This is probably my only strike. And then the vegan police kind of notches down every single beat of what really just Todd had done. And so we have the vegan police that goes on and takes away Todd's vegan powers. And so now Scott goes on to state, it's like, well, hey, like, at first you were vegan, but now you will be gone. And then he, like, just, he takes them out, he just wipes them out. So we now have, of course, Scott taking out Todd. Now we we also had the moment where Todd goes on and ends up punching Knives, and because Knives gets up in his estate that she had kissed Scott's lips, and Scott's lips had kissed Envy's lips. So in a roundabout way, Knives states that she was to kiss the lips of Envy, and she's like, oh my god, this is amazing. And then all of a sudden, we have Todd, who gets up and punches Knives, and he's like, I'm not afraid to hit a girl, I'm a rock star. And so we all of a sudden have young Neil, who looks at Scott and is like, he just knocked the highlights out of her hair. he just knocked the highlights out of her hair. And so Scott ends up wanting to go on and try to punch Todd as a revenge thing, and Todd is to showcase he has vegan powers. And we even had Steven and I think the band members that are all asking, it's like, well, wait a minute, like, how is it that you have vegan powers? And we have Todd that goes on and explains, it's like, well, you know how, like, sometimes they state that you are only using like 10% of your brain. Well, like, the other 90% is just you, like, on, like, Kurtz and Whey or whatever kind of real, like meal that you're eating or whatever. So, like, stating that if these people went vegan, they would all have superpowers like him, but they don't. So, anyways, like, it would be funny to just have one random person like, hey, I'm vegan and I don't have superpowers. Just to, like, shut up, whoever you are. Anyways, so yeah. So next up, we go on to have the aftermath of all that, and Scott, of course, is getting these migraines, and he is just really wanting to talk to Ramona and ask, like, well, hey, can you give me a list of all these exes that you have? So every time we go into this, I already know who the next ex is. So we have Ramona who's like, okay, like, I'll go on and give you a big, massive list of everyone that I slept with or everyone that I've been with. So we then have this realized that this only leads to Scott now having to go on and fight another evil ex. And so Scott is just like, oh my god, like, I don't want to fight a girl. And so we finally have Ramona that pitch hits for Scott here. And so weirdly enough, we have Roxy who grabs this belt and starts doing this kind of weird whipping with this belt. And we have Ramona, who is to bizarrely, out of this bag that she has this huge, massive, like, hammer that is kind of like the size of a broom, where at the end you have this big, massive, like, Thor Mjolnir, like, hammer at the end, but it's this big, massive stick thing. So it's like a staff that has a hammer at the end of one of the parts. So Ramona is going on and talking with Roxy. So Roxy's mentioning how, like, she's going to break Ramona up into parts so she can send her off to Gideon. And we also have Roxy who calls Ramona a has-been. So I thought that was all just pretty funny. So we have Roxy that is fighting off Ramona, but then we just really have Ramona, or we have Roxy that's ticked off at Scott, because it's like, well, hey, you're having your girlfriend do all your battles for you, you lazy piece of crap. That's not what he states, but I'm going with a more censored route. So we have then Roxy who grabs Scott's hands and his legs and starts kind of like forcing Scott to then punch this girl. And it looks really flimsy, but like it is what it is with this film. So we finally have at one point where Roxy is to separate both Scott from Ramona, and Scott falls into the ground. And so we have Roxy who does this really like athletic leg thing where she puts her leg right by her head and she lifts her leg up like this, and it's like, well, yeah, your BF is gonna get F'd in the A or whatever. So we all of a sudden have this kind of slow motion part where we have Scott who is talking to Ramona, And so there seems to be some weakness for Roxy that Ramona is telling Scott. It's like, hey, touch her in the back of the leg because that's her weak point. And Scott's like, well, how do you know that? It's because, like, well, hey, yeah, when we were intimate together. And Scott's like, no, 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 I get it. All right. So Scott touched the back of this girl's leg, and this girl just kind of falls down and is to state that Scott will never be able to please uh, Ramona like uh, like that, and then she ends up confettiing. So we have again where Scott is to realize, like, okay, like, we have like a really rocky moment between both Scott and both Ramona. And so Ramona finally does give Scott this list. And so they end up finding out, coincidentally, the people that are next on the list is the same band that SBB is going to fight in this next Battle of the Bands thing. So, come to find out, we have the Katiyanagi twins, the Katiyanagi twins. Oh my god, I'm just gonna call them the K twins for the rest of this thing. They really had a very small part, and there was no real fighting here, so I won't have to be very descriptive. But both the twins are to be called Kyle and Ken, so it doesn't really matter. They aren't really all that lengthy into this battle, so this will be easy to cover, luckily. So we going to have them go to this next gig, and they realize that there is this big massive sign that has too many explanation points. And so come to find out, this gig is going to be an amp versus amp, that both of them are going to be performing at the same time. And we have certain characters who are like, well, how does that work? So they go in and they find out that this is going to be like they're going to be sharing time between one another. So we have the SBB go up there, and we find that like these guys like have a wall of amps, and they're like, they have keyboards, but it looks like they're like mostly DJs, and so it's like, okay, I don't get how this really works and how this is a legitimate band here that they're going up against, but it is what it is. So we have these guys that end up playing. Oh, I also forgot about the bass battle part between both Todd and Scott, but I'll get to that. I'll pedal back to that. I knew I was going to forget it, so I was like, oh my god, yeah, I need to remember this now. But let's get to this battle, and then we'll get to the bass playing part. So we had the twins that go on to start playing this music and are kind of blowing the SBB away. And so we have Steven that mentions, is like, well, hey man, like, why don't we just quit now? Like, we'll just disband the band. And because they're also starting to realize that Gideon is in the audience, and if they get smoked by this band, they're going to be like dead forever. And so Scott is looking into the crowd and realizing that Ramona and Gideon are together. And come to find out, Scott realizes that Gideon is to be G-Man, the last person on the list. So we have Scott that's like, okay, like let's get this together. Like, come on, if you can figure out one piece of it, I can figure out the other piece. So I think this is at some point when like Scott states that this is like the beginning of one of their songs. I thought that was so weird, as if they're kind of queuing it up here. I think they either do that in this point or they do it at the other band part. But so we have SBB going on and playing against these twins, and we all of a sudden bizarrely have this weird, goofy, like monster versus monster thing, as if this is Godzilla, bizarrely. And so the twins are to somehow be represented, these like dual-headed like dragons that are kind of flying around, and we have the SBB that has this kind of like bulldog Sasquatch looking monster that like is on their side. So we have at one point that between the both of them kind of playing on simultaneously, we all of a sudden have the SBB monster takes both of the dragon heads and smashes them together and defeats them, and so we have the twins getting blown away, blasted, smashing through their amps, and we just have this huge big point system that shows up. So that covers all of that. So now we have Scott that is running after Ramona, because we have Wallace, who had gone on to tell Scott, it's like, well, hey, you need to really tell her like how you feel to really win her over here. You have to tell her the big L word. And Scott is just like, well, like, lesbian? And he's like, no, the other L word. He's like, lesbians? So Scott goes on to then talk to Ramona, and so Scott is like, well, hey, I want to be in lesbian with you because I feel like I feel these feelings so deeply. And Ramona's like, well, I don't know what that means, but okay, like whatever. But then Ramona is to state that like I think that they should break up, is what she states, because there's something about Gideon that like she just cannot deny. And so Gideon comes in and is like, well, hey guys, like, I don't even care if you win the finale. I want you to go on and, like, I want you to just sign with me. Like, I want you to just kind of sign on this dotted line. You have a record deal. And so Scott is like, I don't want your record deal. And all the other bands like, well, we do. We're going to sign away on that. So, oh, we also had the moment where young Neil says that he only plays, like, Tetris and all these other video games besides him playing a bass guitar. But, God, I'm still trying to figure out when I can go on and talk about that whole bass battle. Let's do it now. So, all of a sudden we have Scott playing the bass, and Todd's like, well, hey, somebody wants to get funky. And so they're both playing the bass together. So, we have at some point where Scott blows Todd away, and then we end up, or no. Todd blows Scott away, and that's when they go into the half and half thing. Because Todd is just overall just like he has the vegan powers, and also like he's just a better bass player, yada yada yada. So even to where we have Scott that confirms with SBB that the lineup with young Neil is way better, and we'll get to that. So we have Gideon that goes with Ramona into this limo, and we have Gideon that states, it's like, well, hey, like, Scott, like, it's such a good thing that you met Ramona, because that had me re-meet up with her, and so, like, all this is just kind of kismet, and so on and so forth. So Gideon is like, well, hey, no hard feelings, and, like, I created that whole Seven Evil X's thing when I was in a bad place, but now that I'm back with Ramona, like, everything is peaches and cream. So, he didn't say that, but anyways. So, Gideon is, of course, putting this club together, this big, massive club that he just built out of nowhere, which is really just a set piece. So, we, of course, have Scott needing to fight for not only Ramona, but also for himself. So, Scott goes into this club realizing that SBB is playing there. So Scott ends up trying to go through these numbers of different password things. And so Scott, the first person he talks to, is like, hey, what's the password? And he's like, whatever. He's like, okay, you're cool. And then the next time there's another password, Scott just shrugs and they're just like, okay, you're cool. So Scott goes into this club and we have SBB that's playing along, and then they're like, "Oh, hey, Scott, like, I'm sorry that we're doing this, but we want to get paid." And Scott's like, "No, no, 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 I get it. Like, Neil, great, everything. Like, you guys are, you're doing well." So Scott then turns and is to find Gideon, and so we now, of course, have Scott who is to tell Gideon that he has beef with him and that they're going to fight this out. So we all of a sudden have Scott that ends up having this sword come out of his chest, and he ends up getting it because the power of love. And so Scott takes his sword out of his chest and then is to go on and have him start fighting all these hooded individuals and decking them all off and having them all turn into coins and change and whatever. So we have Scott that goes on to make his way to Ramona, and we also had Scott that when he was to go on and beat the twins, he ended up getting this one up that he slapped, and he's like, I'm going to go on and get a life. And he immediately sees Knives, and Knives is like, well, hey, I'm here because you were doing this gig. And Scott is just like, there's nothing I can say to her. And so, like, Scott just kind of walks off. So Scott is now talking to Ramona, and all of a sudden Knives comes flying in. And she, of course, is going on. And here's the thing. I think people should count how many times Gideon puts a thing of gum in his mouth throughout these scenes. It feels like he has gone on to have like 7 or 8 to 10 different things of gum in his mouth throughout a number of these situations. And so, like, I should have gone on and counted how many times that he had this gum in his mouth, because it seemed like he just kept popping it in. And then at one point he swallows the gum and he's like, I'm going to have this in my system for like 7 years. How much gum did you chew? Think about that. Anyways, so we have all of a sudden now Ramona and Knives fighting one another because Knives is upset that Ramona had broken Scott's heart. So Knives is doing the right thing here and supporting Scott, because also there is quite a bit of times where both Scott and Knives are fighting together to try and fight off Gideon. But so Scott is talking to both Knives and Ramona, and he ends up getting knifed in the back because of it. Because of his distractional, like him talking about, oh yeah, I cheated on you, Knives, with Ramona, and he kind of cops out about it, and he's trying to like, well, hey, so we then have Scott who dies. Scott dies and is now in this desert environment, and we now have Ramona that tells Scott that legitimately Gideon has this kind of inhibitor chip on Ramona's neck that controls her. To have now Scott state, it's like, well, that would have been some useful information that I could have had, but now that I'm dead, like, I don't have that information, so, like, that sucks. So, but we come to have Scott realize he still has the 1-up, so Scott uses it. So it's kind of like the Ready Player One thing, where I think in that thing we had Archibald or whoever the main character was that ends up having like the one up coin that he ends up saving. I think that is Ready Player One. It's been a while since I've seen that movie. Even though I could probably go on and recite certain things or whatever, it's been a while. It's been a while. Anyways, so we have Scott who one ups. He goes all the way back to him needing to go back into the club, having a number of these whole things that he's already done. This time around, we have Scott that states, like, hey, your hair is stupid. Hey, like, I'm just gonna, like, punch these people out and get through this club. So Scott just continues to just randomly punch all these people that are to be these security guards. And so Scott is to go on and want to fight Gideon. And so we have Scott who tells SBB it's fine, like, you guys are okay. Gideon, we quickly have Scott who's to say, hey, Beef, you're a horrible person, this and that. So Scott goes on to fight Gideon again after fighting and getting the power of self-respect from out of this sword. So we have Scott that is decking all these goons again, and then this time around we have, of course, Scott that fights Gideon, and then all of a sudden we then have Scott that rushes to Ramona and is now Scott stating, like, hey, Knives, I know you're around here, and then all of a sudden she comes flying in, and Scott is to now tell both Ramona and Knives the absolute truth, that it's like, well, hey, I cheated on both of you, like, I'm gonna own up to that now, and so, like, hey, friends, kind of thing. So, come to find out, we then have Gideon that gets back up, and so we have both Knives and we have both Scott that starts fighting Gideon, and so it gets to the point where Gideon does fall over, and like the main thing that he ends up mentioning, it's like, well, hey, I'm blowing up, and so Scott's like, yeah, you are gonna blow up, and that I think is when he kicks him in the face, and we then have all these coins that come flying out of nowhere, and Gideon is just to leave his glasses, and so we have Scott and we have Knives going back to Ramona. It's like, well, hey, it looks like you guys are like a really good team. And Scott's like, yeah, we really are. But that isn't going to mean that like Scott and Knives are going to get back together. So we all of a sudden have bizarrely Gideon who is talking through his glasses. And so he states, it's like, well, like, you still have one enemy to face, Scott, and that is to face yourself. Because at some point when Ramona was to get broken up by Scott, technically that made him his own worst enemy. So Ramona, Knives, and Scott are all like getting ready to like fight in their Power Ranger poses. But then Scott is like, no, like, I'll take on like Mega Scott alone. And so we have Ramona and we have Knives kind of waiting for Scott, and the next thing we end up seeing is both Mega Scott and Scott just kind of walking out together and like, hey, yeah, like, we'll share a coffee together. Yeah, we'll share this together. All right, yeah. So they end up walking away, both Scott and Mega Scott. And so Scott ends up saying, like, yeah, that was a really cool dude, yada, yada, yada. So we all of a sudden have Knives who notices that Scott is to have, like, hey, like, your hair is getting shaggy. And all of a sudden Scott has his hat on and so on and so. So yeah, so all of a sudden the real thing here is that Ramona is to state to Scott, it's like, you know what, like I've like kind of put you through a lot, Scott, and I think I just need to be like on my own. And so Ramona is to just kind of walk off, and Knives ends up turning to Scott. It's like, well, hey, like, go after her. Like, you've like been beating all these people down. You've fought all these people. like, you deserve to go after this girl. And Scott kind of checks with like Nyes that she'll be fine because she's already like dating young Neil anyways, who ends up just becoming Neil. As we of course have Scott who states like, Neil, you have now, or young Neil, you have now just become Neil. So we have Scott that goes on and is to run off to grab Ramona, and it's to state, it's like, well, hey, like, if you're going somewhere, if you're going off somewhere, can I go too? And Ramona's like, yeah, like, that makes a lot of sense. So all of a sudden, the next thing we end up seeing is this thingy, this door that appears out of nowhere, and both Scott and Ramona leave. So that ends up rolling up credits. And oh, we also had the scene where like Scott goes on, like bashes his head against uh this one pole, and he keeps going thud 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 every time that he smacks into it. I thought that was kind of funny. Other than that, there's a trillion things that I can go on and state that I probably had forgotten about. So let me know in the comments below if there were any of those. Uh, with that said, there is technically a goofy little end credit scene by the end of this thing where it's just a little Scott Pilgrim thing going on and doing this kind of little video game thing, and it doesn't really mean much. Like, it doesn't add anything to the film, but it's just this cool little finish up visual that I thought was interesting. And hey, it's better. Like, you could easily just kind of fast forward through all the credits, so like that was one fun thing. But otherwise, I'm gonna say that I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.